I'm here with Michael and Sherry again for this will be the third part of our discussion on the Apocalypse of St. John by Emil Bock. It's a pretty dense book, so our first discussion covered really just the foreword and the introduction, and then the second one, chapter 1, and then kind of got to a little bit of the start of this chapter.
That's fine.
And so now we're going to focus on chapter 2, and chapter 2 is focused primarily on the letters to the churches, but it begins with a discussion about symbolic numbers, as opposed to just quantitative numbers, like the qualitative sense of numbers, and it's specifically on 7 and 12. Did anyone have any thoughts that they wanted to add about Bock's treatment of that concept?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
Go ahead, Michael. You go first.
Well, first of all, I guess you mean he equates them with time and space. Does anyone know how he gets that? Is something that I'm unaware of?
Okay. So he takes that from, he says that 7 represents the fullness of time, because like the base unit from time for antiquity has really been the week, right?
Yeah.
The 7-day week. So it kind of represents like the base unit of time. So and he's also has, I think he has the creation story in mind here too, because it's 6 days of active creation and then a 7th day of rest. Right. So it represents the fullness of the fullness of the cycle. So and there's a pretty long, like, cross-cultural history of viewing 7 in that way symbolically, and then the 12 is even more obvious because that's like it's the zodiac, which so it represents the fullness of space. So it's also
the calendar. I mean,
right, yeah, right.
7 days is a week and 12 months is a year, and
which is, and it's a year because it represents the Earth basically traveling through space. The fullness of the zodiac, the fullness of space symbolically. So so that's now on the thought I had this morning, and this isn't really in Bock's text, but so we can skip over it if we want, but he is talking about Revelation, and the bride imagery is pretty heavily featured in the text. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit, and it may be something he covers later, but I had a thought about that in connection to the number 7 and the fullness of the week, because the final day of the cycle, the day of rest in the Hebrew worldview is the Sabbath. So I was thinking about the connection between the Sabbath queen and the bride.
Sabbath queen.
Which actually,
I'm not familiar with that.
So the Sabbath is actually addressed in the feminine in Orthodox Judaism. So like there'll be prayers and songs to invitate that are an invitation to the arrival of the Sabbath queen. So the Sabbath queen is like this personified feminine aspect of the divine. And the Sabbath also represents like the fullness of the cycle of creation. And it's the image of the Sabbath queen seems to be naturally connected to the idea of the church as the bride too.
Yeah.
Like,
so
in fact, it's the Sabbath queen is actually like, it's both, like the language it refers to her can be means both bride and queen. So I think there's a pretty clear connection there. I think you actually, Michael, actually a few weeks back, I thought you might have something to say about this, because a few weeks back you linked me some stuff from the Messianic rabbi Jonathan Cahn, and this is a thing he actually talks about quite a lot.
Yeah, well, I am familiar with that, but I didn't know about the connection to the Sabbath. Is that something he makes as well? Yeah.
Well, I don't know if he explicit. I don't know if he explicitly makes that connection. But I mean, my wife is Jewish, so and I've actually been in the synagogue and heard these references. So I know they're definitely like
Yeah.
it's a thing. Yeah, there is this thought of the, um, um, uh, and then
In that article that you posted, Nate,
yeah,
from the Chabad,
yeah,
there's the Hebrew word "keep it holy" denotes marriage.
right,
Now, this is my Sabbath, keep it holy, which is kind of interesting. That's what it says in this article here. It says, it's as if God is saying, remember my promise to the Sabbath and be sure to marry her.
Well, and also here's the interesting thing is that like in the Sabbath ritual, it's actually like the female head of the household. It's actually the mother who actually like lights the two candles and then ritually like waves her hands over the light 3 times.
Yeah, she
like
starts.
Welcome. So
Yeah.
which kind of shows a connection of that human feminine to this divine like Sabbath queen archetype.
So what's the connection to Bock here with this?
I just think it just reinforces his. I think it just the only connection is that it reinforces this notion of 7 as the fullness of time because it connects it to the Sabbath because the Sabbath is the fullness of time. Because what the Sabbath represents is God's invitation for humanity to enter into the peace of God, which is to rest in eternity and to cease living in like the cycle of or to cease to be in the cycle of becoming and to rest in the eternity and the peace of God, which is the Sabbath time. Right.
And
the completion, right. Where the place, the Sabbath is the place where time has fully become space.
Okay, so that's what I want to talk about.
You don't think we've exhausted that, huh?
Michael's he's like, oh no, here
we can totally talk about that more. I'm happy. The conversation should go wherever it naturally wants to go.
Wherever I want it to
so
go.
I actually think that so that actually this is kind of good because it ties like the different layers of symbolism together, right?
Well,
so
I think this is really actually super important for some reason.
Okay.
I don't know why I do, but so you know, like he says here, I'm just going to read this. 7 is the number of time. It expresses the rhythm of evolution. Its simplest manifestation is the week with its 7 days. 12 is the number of space. Its best illustration is the 12 signs of the zodiac. There we experience what space is. The first part of the apocalypse advances entirely in rhythms of 7. In the first chapter, the number 7 occurs in the significant context of the 7 stars and the 7 golden candlesticks. Then the great circles of 7 unfold. 7 messages, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 vials of wrath follow each other. So, and then where the mounting circles leave the earthly plane between the messages and the seals, the quiet note of the number, and I love how he expresses this, the quiet note of the number 12, the number of space begins to be heard for the first time. And he gets into, a little further in, he gets into the intensity of time, right? Like how it becomes more and more pressing, more urgent. And what I find super interesting is having tripped over Lee Smolin, right? And Max Tegmark, these two physicists, and I know nothing about physics, so don't ask me anything really, significant. but what they say actually corresponds to what this is saying, because they say that time and space are one thing, that time is just a series of events, okay? And that out of time, out of these events, we create space. Space is created. That's what they're talking about. And that's exactly what happens in this context. You have time, right? Starting out, condensed, let's say, and becoming more and more intensified. and then you move into space, which is I just find fascinating that this is what some physicists are actually seeing. They're seeing that sequence of events, the way that they are together.
Well, I think a lot of times that particularly that particularly advanced kind of physics, it relies a lot more on intuition than we think. So
well, that's why I posted all those Einstein quotes the other day.
Right. So I think the reason, perhaps the reason we're able to like work out the abstract mathematics to demonstrate this sort of picture is because we do have this natural intuition that somehow that we get occasionally a taste of time that is not how we experience it, right? Then our normal experience of time is of this like sequential flow, past, present, future, this kind of like narrative flow of time. And yet our physics gives us this picture of time that I would say looks more like what theology would tell you is time from the divine point of view.
Right.
It's not really, that's not really what it's like at all.
Well, like in that Lee Smolin video, and I read this last time, but I'll read it again.
Right.
In light of this passage that I just read from Bock, Lee Smolin says, if you write down a list of all the casual relationships between all the events, so there's your sequence, right? Time in the universe, you describe the geometry of space-time almost completely. And he said the only thing you have to add is how many events there were, right? And this is what I find so fascinating about Revelation, is that we're actually looking at a series of events, right?
Right.
The 7 messages, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 vials of wrath. These are happening in a sequence. And as they expand, they create, we move into 12, we move into space. Right. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say about it, because
okay,
that's kind of my fascination at the moment.
Even though like an elementary understanding of the Big Bang like takes you to the same conclusion, right? Because at the beginning there's like zero space, there's like an infinitely small like point that all space is and matter is cooked up inside, and then over time we just have this huge expansion, right? Like it just gets bigger and bigger. And that's the funny thing though, is it's like it from the modern perspective, it seems like all this space is kind of wasted. Like it's, and that which makes me think, well, what is it for? Because it's a lot.
Well, there's who knows how big the new heaven and the new earth are going to be.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just preparation for that. I don't know.
I like that. It's wasted. What makes you say that? I just have to.
Well, I think I
have to ask. That's.
I think that's a sort of it's sort of the modern nihilism of sort of like a it's all meaningless and just exceptionally large, and we're exceptionally small, so we don't have a meaningful way to connect to it. It's just kind of like a brute fact.
Well, you could get into the psychology of that, I think, too, because we say that's a waste of space, right? If it's not filled up with the right things. So for us, space has to be utilized. Space needs to be filled up with something. And when you have that vast expanses of empty space, it feels wasted, right? But what if space-time it's an energy, it's a force. Like Lee Smolin said, the only thing, and Max Tegmark both said, the only thing that actually exists is space-time. Stuff doesn't exist. Just space-time exists, which I thought was really, really, really interesting.
What it makes me think of is, I wonder, like, because like again, the end of the whole process is heaven and earth are together, right? So the infinite somehow comes into the finite, and it makes me wonder. Maybe all this space is the infinite getting itself into the finite, because if you look at again, we were talking about like the acceleration of time last time. We were like how it seems like time is speeding up. Well, if you talk about the space, it seems like the space itself is expanding at a rapid, like a more and more rapid pace. Which is why they talk about like, you know, even if we could go this, you know, travel at the speed of light, we couldn't get to all the places in the universe because they're traveling away from us faster now than the speed of light. And it's not like it's not just that, you know, we have this idea of like, you know, like the sun or like these objects are flying away from each other. No, it's like the fabric of space time is expanding at this accelerating clip.
Isn't that what becoming is though?
Yeah.
Like, isn't that a perfect example of becoming? It's so dynamic, like it's just constantly expanding. It doesn't really, things aren't floating away from each other. The relationships are intact, but the whole thing is just growing vast. And that is our experience in the journey of becoming as well, right? Like you can step into that. Like that's what the flow state, that's why you have a sense of timelessness, I think, in the flow state, is because you are like, you're in the middle of what it feels like perhaps to become something, to be becoming, right?
Well, what is the image that Bock uses? Let me just go back to the text here really quick, because I think Bock says something useful for, at least in terms of trying to understand what he's trying to say about this idea of time becoming space, because he actually uses an example from the opera Parsifal.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, when Parsifal in Wagner's opera sets foot for the first time upon the territory of the Grail, he becomes aware that his pace alters. A strange, new, unsuspected relationship to time and space occurs to him. Astonished, he says, I have hardly taken a step, yet I feel I have gone far. Mm-hmm. And his age guide, Garnemons, explains, you see, my son, here time becomes space.
Mm-hmm.
So it happens in Grail country. So so that ties it to like the otherworldly, the super sensible, right? Because it's happening outside of. So Parsifal has been taken to another world temporarily, because Grail country it's not really this world. So he stepped outside of it. So his relationship to time and space has changed because he's been taken out of becoming, and he is approaching closer to being, because he's where the Grail is found, right?
Right.
Which is the cup of Christ. So he's starting to approach God. So as he's approaching closer to God, he starts to experience things from the divine point of view, where he takes but a tiny step and he feels like he's traveled, immense distance by just taking the tiniest of steps.
George MacDonald plays on that in Lilith too, where, the seasons happen at an accelerated rate, and one day is like his whole one half a day, like 12 hours. The day is summer and the night is winter. And, there's this complete confusion about.
Well, this is all through the folklore of the British Isles. Like, right. This is like, that's what entering fairy
land
does,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
but when you're talking about that Grail country, I thought of Rilke, and he says here, believe in a love that is being stored up for you like an inheritance, and have faith that in this love there is a strength and a blessing so large that you can travel as far as you wish without having to step outside it. It seems to me that almost all our sadnesses are moments of tension, which we feel as paralysis because we no longer hear our astonished emotions living, because we are alone with the unfamiliar presence that has entered us, because everything we trust and are used to is for a moment taken away from us, because we stand in the midst of a transition where we cannot remain standing, because we're actually transitioning, right? And then he says, that is why the sadness passes. The new presence inside us, the presence that has been added, has entered our heart, has gone into its innermost chamber, and is no longer even there, is already in our bloodstream, and we don't know what it was. We could easily be made to believe that nothing happened, and yet We have changed, as a house that a guest has entered changes. We can't say who has come. Perhaps we will never know, but many signs indicate that the future enters us in this way. The future enters us in this. So you know, you always end up talking about time. You know, like you just wherever you turn, when you want to dig a little bit deeper, then you're bumping into all this stuff always. You know, and I just find that really interesting. You know, he says a little further down, and that's why it's so important to be solitary and attentive when one is sad, because the seemingly uneventful and motionless moment when our future steps into us is so much closer to life than that other loud and accidental point of time when it happens to us as if from the outside. The quieter we are, the more patient and open we are in our sadnesses, the more deeply and serenely the new presence can enter, and the more we can make it our own, and the more it becomes our fate.
You know, I just want to tie this back to what you were saying about relationships, in connection to this idea of space and time. And we have this phrase that we use sometimes where we talk about quality time.
Yeah.
Right. And then later on in this chapter, Bock is going to talk about like how like the pressingness, how time seems to become more pressing.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily about the duration, but the intensity of time.
Yeah.
So, but the way we normally think about time is quantitatively. We track the hours, right? We track its passing. So maybe part of what this is trying to point is that in the spiritual realm, in the supersensible realm, in the kingdom, time it has more of a qualitative than a quantitative factor. Like maybe that's like the real difference between time and eternity, is that eternity is like really a purely qualitative state.
Yeah. Well,
which can explain why we have this, like where we have, like when we have those little moments that both of us have talked about, like, you know, time stops kind of moments. It's not, we value those more than, you know, long quantitative, you know, like those seem more real to us.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
like they seem more real, right?
What's interesting is what I've been thinking about for a while now is that time begins when we're born and it ends when we die, right? So we have this idea that this is my time, you know, here on Earth, my 70 odd years or whatever. But you know, it's been demonstrated by Christ that death has no sting, right? Death is no longer an issue. It's not the end. Death is not the end, right? So, right. But you do enter time. So you're born into it, but then you pass through into timelessness. Right?
And so I'm going to tie this back to the Sabbath. This is why you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath.
Right.
Because the Sabbath is about appreciating time qualitatively.
Okay.
That's why you're supposed to, that's why you're not supposed to risk doing anything that even has the risk of turning into work.
Yeah, but sometimes, I was just going to say the Sabbath can become a full-time job too.
Sure,
right?
sure. Because we can spoil everything. I'm talking about like what the spiritual idea of the Sabbath is trying to create the space for.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, Jews are prone to the same difficulties that we are as Christians. They're gonna screw it up too. But that doesn't mean that what they've been given as like a spiritual understanding of how to look at time through this idea of the Sabbath doesn't have like, isn't pointing at something.
Time is like falling down the, Alice is falling down the rabbit hole. I mean, Sabbath,
Right.
that's what it should be.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Right. Yes. Or A Journey to Fairyland.
Right. Or going through the mirror in Lilith.
It is. I mean, and that's very clearly. I mean, if you listen, it is the. I mean, there's a reason why the ritual happens at twilight, right? Because it's like this.
The end.
It's this intermediate. It's neither night nor day.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just, there's something about like twilight itself is symbolically important.
Well, it's death. That's why I say death is the portal, right, into time.
Right.
And yeah, it's the narrow gate, and birth is also an entry into time through a narrow gate. Like, if you think about it, right? It's too narrow, the passageway. And so is time. And those are the two things that you have to do alone, right? The way is narrow, right? It's a one-man job. Like you come in through the narrow gate and you leave through the narrow gate. Yeah.
Michael, got anything to add?
Well, this is kind of unrelated, but it seems so. I just reread C.S. Lewis's Until We Have Faces.
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah, which it's a very interesting book, and in light of all this stuff about like a universal history, I suddenly see what he's doing there more clearly. Like, he's trying to take like this myth of, it's Cupid and Psyche retold, the Greek myth, but it's kind of brought into this sort of medieval frame, right? Which is, kind of like the whole thing with the Arthurian legends and this sort of, and I don't know what all this stuff. I just keep running into this stuff everywhere. Like, even here, they have Parsifal and Wagner's opera here as setting this up. And so one of the key themes in that book is when you were talking, about Rilke too, and this guest that enters the house, like that's a big thing in that book. Until We Have Faces, that there's this imaginary house that Psyche is living in, and she can see it, but Oral, her sister, can't. And she's being visited at night by the god who she is the wife of the god, but she can't see him, but she has this like relationship with him. And I feel like this element of the church being the bride is like this aspect of erotic love in terms of our relationship to God that to me seems completely overlooked. Like, it's just kind of off the table, because when we talk about it, we're like, oh, well, we are symbolically the bride. When a modern person says that, even in this group, I think when we say symbolic to some extent, what we really mean is not real.
Well,
what was clear to me in reading that book is that C.S. Lewis is trying to make the point, like, no, this is reality. This myth is a way at digging under what is really going to be happening with the church. And he's trying to tell it in kind of a clever way, because to get around our sort of modern categories, right? And use the artifice of a story to try and get these ideas into you.
Well, there's a way in which we're connected to the feminine aspect within God from the creation story, even because breath, ruach, is feminine in Hebrew, and it's God's ruach that is breathed into Adam to make him a living soul. So, like, it's already telling you right there that God has put into us this feminine aspect of that of himself, his own breath, his own spirit. and the entire story.
But and that interpenetration between the two things is, you can't talk about that without,
correct, because
leaning on our understanding.
Because God is more intimate. Like God is in a very serious way, like more intimate to you than you are to yourself.
Which is so
because it is
anathema
that
to,
breath of God that allows you to be a living soul in the first place.
right? Which isn't. I don't. Yeah. Which I think is not how the Protestant world sees things. Right. It's kind of, it's these weird layers that are distinct. Like even while you talk about, Jesus lives in my heart, it's like a it's like a symbolic, it's like weird. It's
special room.
Yeah,
it's a special room in your house.
But cool. I mean, it's like, I don't want to, like, I mean, it's like people are going to understand things in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
The only problem, like, it wouldn't bother me so much if it wasn't for the fact that those particular type of evangelical Protestants are the first group of people who are willing to, like, propositionally weaponize their ideas against other people who are understanding things from understanding really what is amounts to the same idea through a different set of language. Like, so much of it is just a war over the way you're understanding it linguistically, when that's not ultimately what it's about.
Yeah.
If it just stays at the level of, like, what you understand through language and proposition, and it doesn't become an ontic reality for you, it doesn't absolutely into your being, then you're not really participating in Christ. Period.
Yeah.
So there's just way too much effort. There's way too much effort spent on warring over whose propositional understanding of these ideas is right.
Well, going back to that idea of erotic love and marriage and Adam and Eve and all the rest of it, like, I think even marriage is a feeble attempt to describe the relationship that we have to God, because in the beginning, God pulled Eve right out of it.
But Adam. It's not really that feeble, right? Though, because it's kind of like, because I think it's pointing you right at the Trinity.
Well, I know where you're going.
You know where I'm going. I do. I think it's pointing you right at the Trinity, though.
But I think we see it as feeble because we're so thoroughly modern. Even right. In this little group where we're trying to deconstruct our modernism, right?
Right.
We still are so conditioned by our culture and experiences that we don't really believe the two become one flesh. We don't believe that.
Right. But if that is the reality that that's
not how we act.
If that is in fact the reality, if what you're trying to reflect is this Trinitarian idea of unity and multiplicity, is there a possible better analogy, metaphor, whatever you want to call it, to use than to point at marriage? I don't think there is.
I don't think so.
I don't think there's a better way of doing it. I think the biblical authors chose the perfect image. And I think that maybe sure. Like, the more seriously we take, and here's the thing, is the more we actually embody in our existence, like trying to live into a faithful marriage, the more we'll understand it. Like, even if we can't articulate it,
mm-hmm.
like, even if it's beyond our intellectual articulation, it's like, I mean, if you find like a really happily married, like, old Christian couple, that has lived a really ennobled life, and had like wonderful children, and that have gone on to have wonderful grandchildren, I don't care whether they can articulate it or not. They've lived it. They've done it. And that's what's important.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I guess I just want to clarify my phrasing of feeble attempt.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry.
I didn't mean to. I can get going. Just don't feel free to interrupt me and say, "Hey, Nate, chill." It's fine.
No, I know about, you know, what your thoughts on the Trinity and that metaphor or that picture of marriage. But what I'm saying is that, you know, what we are looking forward to, like Paul says, we see through a glass darkly, but one day we will know as we are known. And that, you know, Paul Vanderklay makes that reference often, how, you know, he's married for so many years to his wife and he still discovers new things about her, right? And that is true. And so if you think about it in those terms, like you've got this you know, consummate relationship, right, of intimacy with one another, and yet you also have the preservation of personhood. So you are still a mystery to your partner. At some, you know, you just are, right?
Mhm.
Like I can know that when my husband is yawning, he's hungry. And he can't know that. He doesn't know that. But I know, oh, I better get dinner ready. He's yawning. Right?
Right.
Stuff like that. But there's a lot about him that I don't know. And vice versa, you know? So
But
that's interesting to me too, though. Like that's that unity and multiplicity.
exactly.
Right? That
That's
preservation.
exactly it. The
personhood.
preservation of the personhood.
Mhm.
But yeah, there's a real relational unity that is
Yeah.
not at all trivial. In fact, it is like when it's done best, it like better mirrors the agapic love that is the creative energy that bursts the universe out of nothing than anything else that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's why I think the whole idea of knowing, like in that scripture, when Paul says, "One day you will know as you are known." Again, I'm going to jump on my little language bandwagon and say that, you know, language is a barrier in that sense because we're stuck behind our own definitions of what those words actually mean, and that can cause us to be misunderstood, right? Or to misunderstand someone else. But if
right,
you are
to think he's to think he means known like you know an object instead of known like you know a person.
I think he means that you will know, so you will still have this unity and multiplicity. You will still have these individuals, but they will be one. They will know as they are known. There will be, well, I imagine, I don't know, I imagine there will be no language because everything will be so perfectly communicated that words would just be superfluous, really, right? And so you have this, and that's the marriage of the Lamb. That is the consummation.
I don't know, but the image of the heavens is always as full of song, so I don't know that there'll be no language.
Well,
it'll just be maybe a. It won't be.
think
Although
song-
you know what there.
I
You
think
know what
song
there.
is the
You
original
know what there.
language anyway.
You know what there won't be though, Sherry. I can say with fairly great confidence is there won't be any propositional language,
Yeah, yeah.
but there will be song.
We won't have to ask people how they are anymore.
There'll be poetry.
We'll be like, "Hi, how are you?" Because we'll already know.
Right. And there'll be baseball because that is poetry.
Yeah, there you go. Don't worry, Nate. Mhm.
Okay.
This idea of propositional is really interesting because we use it a lot in our group, right? And we use it in a kind of negative sense, right?
Mhm.
Because, and I think, and so I've been thinking about that. What do we actually mean when we say that? Because you never know anything just propositionally, right? There's absolutely zero knowledge that you have about anything that is just propositional. You always know across these different categories, and then you take from that deeper knowledge that's across these different categories. You attempt to formulate something in the propositional. And so I was like, well, why? What is it about the propositional that we have this very negative connotation with? And I think what it is that there's these layers that happen in the propositional to the point where it becomes very easy to lie and not know that you're lying.
Yeah, it's disingenuous. That's exactly what I was going to say. It's disingenuous. It is not. It refuses to acknowledge that it is metaphorical and narrative.
Right.
just as inevitably as poetic language is.
Well, in some sense, it denies those other layers. It denies what's down below as being of importance, and it kind of says, okay, well, and I think oftentimes we find that people will, while thinking of themselves as defenders of truth, they're actually lying, like because they think that there's some quote unquote right answer, right? Whether it's the woke people, whether it's people that have been grown up in a certain denominational or some cult or whatever, there's certain propositions that they think is quote unquote truth, and they will deny their own felt sense of truth in service of that, and they think that is what it means, right? To be a champion of the truth is to lay down what I feel deep inside. I lay that to the side and I say, this is the truth because it's the quote unquote right.
Right, because it's that grasping, holding, seizing kind of knowledge that is so attractive to us. It is, I mean, it's attractive to all of us. And the temptation is once we think we've got a hold of it, then our temptation is to weaponize it.
Something's coming to my mind right now about Jacob talked about this, and maybe you know about this, Nate. In Judaism, there's a word, or I think it's described as an event, or it's a something anyways. When Moses comes down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments, they're written on stone, right?
Yeah.
And what happens to them? They break. He throws them, and they break.
Yeah.
And that seems to me that is what propositions are. They're words written on a stone, right? That doesn't have any flexibility, and and they break. And then it's like I said before, you can't deconstruct what you haven't constructed.
Well, not only do they break, but we can take them and let's use the stone tablet imagery for propositional language again.
Yeah.
We can use them before they break. We can use them to beat other people over the head with them.
Mm-hmm.
To beat them into submission to our solid thing that we have grasped and grabbed and held onto.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is like as long as you are grasping and seizing and holding, you're not going to enter the kingdom.
No, you're possessing it. Yeah.
You're trying, right? Actually, I think that's like Paul was talking in his video today about like men of violence trying to seize hold of the kingdom. And I actually gave Luke a shout out. I said, to channel Luke Thompson for a moment, I think this is referring to the egoic intellect. I really do think that's what it's talking about. Because if that is how you're trying to approach the kingdom, using that grasping, seizing, holding kind of knowledge, it's not going to work.
Yeah, but you know what though? That you have to let go of those graspers, seizers, and
knowers. Right. Like it's
you have
right.
to
Exactly.
Let go of everything, not just the things that are nice, or not just the the sinners or the fringe people, but even the ones like that's why Jesus said, "Love your enemy."
You know how they use like
right?
how they use like put shiny things in a jar to like catch monkeys, right?
Yeah.
That's what the egoic intellect is like for us.
Mm-hmm.
Like we see this shiny thing, this shiny propositional truth that we can grasp and hold on to. And we want to hold on to that, and we don't want to let go of that for dear life. But it turns out that in order to escape the trap, we have to let go of it.
Yeah.
Because it is a trap.
Right. But what I'm saying,
it's the knowledge of good and evil, but that's not the path.
Right. And okay. But like that's true. That's all very true. And
it's the coin, it's the fruit.
But the thing is, I find the thing that I stumble on a lot is that there's also people who want to point at those graspers and seizers of propositions.
Yep, and that's just as wrong.
And that's just as wrong.
That's just as wrong.
That's the exact same movement.
Which is why I'm always careful to say things like, you know what? I don't really care what their propositions are, and I'm not going to argue with them if I see them living a life that shows that at some level whether I agree or disagree with their propositions, that they have at least put some toe in the kingdom,
Yeah.
then who am I to?
Yeah. And I mean, some people have to stand there with like a monkey and with their hand in the coconut for years before they finally figure it out. And, and I mean, I did, right? Like I got from A to B to C, and why can't I grant that to someone else? Like,
right.
Yeah. So,
which is why deconstruction is a good thing. Like, it's not even like it's not a mixed blessing. It's an unambiguously good thing, because the only thing that can deconstruct is that's what you're deconstructing. Because the actual thing, like the actual experience of God, is not deconstructible. It's right there waiting for you to participate in it.
Yeah. Right. And it's kind of like, well, I mean, we're getting way off of the Bock book here.
We are, but I think it's productive conversation, though.
Yeah. There's the idea that, but they're, these people are leading others astray, right? I just don't know. Oh, I had a thought now how I wanted to say it, but now I've lost it. But it's like,
the kind of leading others astray that is a genuine concern is where it is if you have someone who is giving people ideas that actually lead them to engage in behavior that is destructive to them.
Right.
It's like, and
but
it's
that's
also
happening around us all the time. Like, and that is, I mean, okay, if I think about it in introspectively, I engaged in destructive behavior, destructive to others and destructive to myself.
We all do.
Right. And it was because of propositions. It was because of things that I was holding on to, things that I thought were true. And they weren't necessarily theological. They were just simply propositions. But I honestly don't know how, if I could be who I am without having made that same journey, right? Like it's the conundrum that Dostoevsky talks about.
Because what you are is that web of relationships that you have
summation
formed.
Of all that experience.
It's all those different points of connection.
Right.
They all contribute to who you are. So if you had followed a different path and gone down a different route, then you would literally be a different person.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And this is Leibniz's argument.
Okay, so now I'm gonna have to. I'm not as big a fan. I'm not the big Voltaire fan I was in my. I think Voltaire is easy to appeal to teenagers, because he's got that.
Oh yeah,
he's got that righteous moral fury, and he's funny, and he uses vulgar humor, and he's easy for a teenager to like, I think.
Mm-hmm, sure. A rebel with a cause.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yes, precisely. Hey, Michael, I feel like we're sucking up all the air here. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
No. When we were talking about all that stuff with the propositional, I kept thinking about Luke's rant about word penises. and I thought it was really interesting because it's like, well, because that links back to what I was talking about earlier, because there is this aspect of erotic love in all this that we overlook, but it's really fundamental, and like we don't want to deal with things that way, because we want to say that we can interact with things at a distance, like that we can kind of touch them, that we can move these propositional things around like Lego pieces, and not be impregnated by the spiritual forces that we're working with.
Right.
Do you think that Do you think that's why Jesus said, if you just look at a woman and lust after her, you've already committed adultery? That's kind of like that, having, what you were talking about the proposition from afar. Like I think about my oldest daughter when she was really little, and I'd say to her, don't eat any of that candy. And I turn around, she's got one in her hand and she's like, right here. And I catch her with it. She goes, I'm just touching it to my lips.
Oh.
Yeah,
Well,
I think that's right.
Right, but it is connected to that kind of legalism, though, because it's like it's wanting to. Here's what I think is wrong with it, and God bless the people who are in it. I know they're trying their best. I'm a universalist. Jesus wins anyway. I'm not worried about you the same way you might be worried about me. So it's not reciprocal. But but the thing is that, like, I totally lost my train of thought. I had something and then I totally just completely lost my train of thought.
Michael was talking about thinking we can hold these propositions out from afar and word penises.
Oh yeah. I was gonna legalism. It is definitely it's intimately tied up with legalism, and ultimately the reason that legalism is wrong is that you're not thinking of God as a person. If you're being legalistic.
Yeah. But I mean, Luke made a really good point, which is that you can't fight them with propositions. Like you almost have to take one for the team. He's like you receive the word penis and you go, oh, well, what do you mean by that? Like you kind of
no, he's right. Yeah, you can't resist. Not resistance to evil by force.
and I think the antidote to this, well, it's funny because the propositional is focused on this quote unquote belief, right? And whatever we mean by that, which when we say belief in the modern phrase, it really we're hinging on some sort of kind of quote unquote certainty. That's really what we're talking about, versus what the word actually means is something more like trust. And I think,
and we're ignoring the overwhelming majority of our mind, of our sensory input. We're just focusing on this little tiny beam and missing everything else.
Yeah, but so a way in which I think you can kind of disarm the person who's in that propositional mode is to radically trust them, and to assume that there's something fundamentally good, and however broken, however these propositional layers are skewing it out of all proportion, and marrying them up to all these principalities that are completely disconnected from what they really, what is really driving it. And there's something to believe that there's something good in there that you can call out of them by believing it, by trusting that it's there in terms of how you interact with
right
them.
Michael, because that's the only way to not get trapped into playing the same game.
Yeah.
And then you will have the extra added taint of self-righteousness on your ends. Because you'll be thinking oh, this person and their silly propositionalism, I know better than that.
That's the thing I was talking about before.
You can't engage on that level. The best thing to do is just smile and nod.
No, the only thing to do is love.
Right. And love and wait for some moment of something deeper and say, oh, can you tell me more about that? I want to hear more about that.
Yeah. Well, but it's also engaging with a deeper reality, which is that this other person and you are you're part of the same thing. So later in the chapter, he quotes Goethe, where he says, only the whole of humanity is the true man.
Right. Yeah.
And then he talks about, there's this bit where he says, from a cosmic point of view, however, a group of people is only valuable when it forms a fellowship, and thereby becomes a church.
Yeah.
Where true fellowship is achieved, heaven cooperates. An angel being becomes the genius of this fellowship and is incorporated in it, just as a human ego is incorporated in the organs of the physical body. the sum total of the men becomes the sum total of the organs of the angel who's embodying the church. And so there's this spiritual reality of all this union that we don't see and we don't really believe in, but we need to kind of
even though we have the language, even though we have the language body of Christ, which is just like, what do you think that's talking about? Son of man, what do you think that's talking about?
Yeah.
You know, you can't really see, this is the thing that I thought about a lot when I first discovered, you know, ultimate reconciliation and the implications of that. You know, like, how does that work itself out down the line for me as an individual? Does that make me love more? Does that make me feel vindicated? Like, how does that make me feel? Like, what does that do? Right. And like I've mentioned this before, it gives me a sense of responsibility toward my fellow man. Like, it actually allows me to love more, you know, like, and I think
it has the it has the actual opposite effect of what a lot of people who are very propositional, you know, evangelical types who are very, very, you know, attached to some version of, you know, the doctrine of hell. What actually happens to someone who takes universalism seriously is the exact opposite of what they think. They think it'll mean that, oh, it doesn't matter what I do because I'm going to be saved anyway. No, what actually happens is you start to understand that I am fundamentally connected to every other human being on the planet in a way that is deeper than I can possibly comprehend, and their suffering is my suffering, and I am responsible to alleviate it as much as I can. Because my destiny and their destiny are linked. Sorry.
Right, my behavior matters. It matters to everyone, right? Everything I do matters. And like Michael, when we talked a long time ago about, you know, that all shall be saved, when he made the point that, you know, it's winners and losers, right? If you're not thinking of an ultimate reconciliation, you can't love properly. To love someone is to let them be, right? With their proposition, with their addiction, with their, you know, like, yeah, you're going to support them. And the only time you can actually help anyone is when they want it. Yep. Okay. You can't go and you can't interject into their lives and say, look, I got a plan for your life. And this, and I know if you just do all these things that I see, everything will be fine. And you're probably right.
But that's not love. That's coercion and domination and control. Right. It's not love.
They'll be like, screw off. Leave me alone.
Right. Yeah. It's demonstrably not love. It's coercion, domination, and control.
Right.
I am trying to conform this person to what I want them to be.
Right. And loving someone means that when they stumble and fall, you're right there to catch them.
Yes.
But that's it. That's all you're doing. Right? That's it.
Yes. This is why I continue to listen to Paul. It's because it's like, propositionally, I would have lots and lots of disagreements with him. But what I see him acting out and the way he interacts with people and the way he relates to people, I have absolutely nothing but admiration for. Exactly. Admiration. So it's like that other stuff, Calvinist versus Universalist, whatever, nonsense. Doesn't matter.
It is nonsense. It actually is.
It really is nonsense at the end of the day, because none of us is going to be fully right in our idea about the thing.
Yep.
Yeah. No, whatever it is, it's going to be beyond, right, what we could comprehend.
Correct.
What we could even imagine, really. So.
And this is the other thing. It's like, and that's the other thing. It's like, if you accept, like, if you seriously accept, like, the idea that there really are no finite foundations, and that the deepest wisdom is a sense of your own not knowing, that is not going to lead you to behave in that kind of like domineering, controlling pattern.
No,
because you'll be humble enough to realize that you almost certainly don't know what's best for that person, and all you can do is be there for them and love them
Yeah.
To the best of your ability, and that's it.
Yeah. That's right.
I'm really glad that I'm so glad that you managed to tie this back to the text, Michael. Because I had forgotten that line was in there, because Harding says something like very, very similar in Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth. And it's like my first intimation of like that idea was like, I read David Bentley Hart's Being, Consciousness, and Bliss like at a time where I was really like struggling between Christianity and some sort of like Eastern non-dualism. And that idea of like the person being a fundamentally relational being is the thing that's like, oh, that made, the minute I got that, I lost all interest in Eastern non-dualism.
Mm-hmm.
Because that only really a Trinitarian ontology is going to actually offer you a path toward maintaining that tension between unity and multiplicity, where you can have real unity and multiplicity at the same time, and neither dissolves the other. So shall we talk about the the letters to the churches, which is like actually the bulk of this chapter, which we haven't even talked about yet. I think the first thing he says is he talks about like basically the pattern of the being laid out in kind of a circuit of two semicircles. So it kind of like, so it's like one semicircle going one direction and then another semicircle going the other direction. That basically, you couldn't call it a circle. It's nothing resembling an actual circle, but it's like a circuit, we could certainly say. And then he talks about like his interpretation of the meaning to each of the letters to the churches. And I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about all 7, but is there one that stood out to either of you that you wanted to definitely make sure we talked about that one?
Yeah, nothing really struck me.
I don't know.
What did you think as a former Pentecostal like myself?
I liked the.
Oh, go ahead, Sherry. Looks like, did Michael lock up on us?
Oh, sorry. I think my internet connection stopped. No, you guys go ahead. I know. Yeah, go ahead.
I can hear you, Sherry. It's actually Michael that I think might have.
You can't hear me?
Oh, now I can. You're back. You're back. Okay. All systems go. I can hear everyone now. So Sherry was starting to say something.
No, I think, yeah, I liked the idea of the two edged sword. In which letter is that now? It's the Pergamus, is it? Smyrna. Yeah, it's actually going to run into what you wanted to talk about, Nate, with Michael. Oh. So I'll let you guys do it because you're the Pentecostals.
Okay. Well, yeah, the one that I was like, I wasn't sure that I agreed with was his I think it's to the letter to Pergamos, I believe.
Yeah.
Pergamon, that he says he interprets the teaching of Balaam to be about speaking in tongues, and I was wondering if Michael had any thoughts on that.
I'm wondering how he makes that link.
Yeah, that was my thought. I'm like, how do you get that?
What does Balaam have to do with?
Well, I can tell you his argument. Okay, let me try to present his argument the best I can.
Okay.
So Balaam is essentially, he's a sorcerer, right? He like pronounces blessings and curses.
Yep.
So it's like he has this like power of language. So
word magic,
right? Exactly. So he's saying that it's the teaching of Balaam as this power of word magic, and that's how he's linking it to tongues. He's saying that tongues is this carryover of this like pagan word magic, and that's how he's linking it to tongues. I just don't see that interpretation. I think that seems like a stretch to me. I also think he also characterizes Paul's view of tongues as being exclusively critical, and I don't think that's a fair reading of what Paul actually says.
Yeah. Well, it seems like Paul did have issues with it in public, but was fine with it privately.
Correct. And this is in the context of a letter to a church, or of a message to a church. So presumably it's what's going on in the church. So if he's right, it would be a public thing. However, later on in the same letter that he talks about, it also says and also the Nicolaitans, and it also mentions and it specifically mentions like the idol worship and prostitution. So to me, it's like when you link the Balaam part to the idol worship and prostitution, it seems to me it's probably more about the idol worship and prostitution than it is about the word magic. Maybe that's a part of it too. Maybe it's all three. But then it says, and also the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, and the Nicolaitans were like a libertine sort of Gnostic sect that thought that they were no longer under the law and could basically do whatever they wanted morally. So they practiced like moral licentiousness. So it seems to me that it's like the overall context seems to suggest like what is being said against the church is that it has these doctrines that are leading to morally questionable behavior.
Okay, well, I had a thought. I'm going to just butt in here because I'll lose my thought. I had a thought later, because we talked about this earlier, Nate, and, this word magic, it's a form of sorcery, right? The Balaam thing, not the tongues, but, what he's referring to as far as Balaam goes. And what I thought of was the prosperity gospel.
You know what? Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the interpretations I ran across when I was like basically having trouble with what Bock did is I did run across one interpretation that suggested that basically Balaam's problem is that Balaam was hyper legalistic, right? So he would refuse.
We also took money to do his
correct. And yeah, that he was hyper legalistic, that he wouldn't actually he wouldn't himself disobey what God told him directly, but he was perfectly fine encouraging other people to go astray and to profit from his services, but he tried to keep himself above reproach. So one of the interpretations I ran into was that Balaam's teaching represents a tendency toward this kind of legalism that is less interested in actually having a relationship with God than of basically trying to access some of the power of God by following the rules properly, which kind of relates it to this whole thing that we were talking about earlier with propositionalism. Because I think that propositionalism has a natural tendency to want to put God, you're basically trying to box God within your propositional system.
Yep.
So that he's fully within your control, and you're taming God in that way. So I think these are, and it is a word magic. That's what it is. And it's a word violence too. It's you're using these words to control and manipulate and dominate.
Possessing. Yeah.
Yeah. But that doesn't seem like tongues.
I had another thought. No, I don't remember what it was.
I mean, in so much as, actually, it can be related to tongues.
But can that awaken?
Well, I think it does. It can relate to tongues because a lot, particularly when tongues are being done in public, as it's trying to demonstrate. Yeah, I can hear you. I think Michael is dropping in and out.
I'm in and out.
I got you now. I'm not sure
Okay.
who's having trouble, but I just have these occasional pauses. Anyway, like, so like a lot of the churches where we have, like, you know, this public demonstration of the gift of tongues, there's also that kind of prosperity gospel stuff that you were talking about, Michael, and they also have this tendency toward this extreme sort of propositionalist sort of expression as well. So it is kind of like, you could tie it to, like, it's an attempt to, like, give a demonstration of that you have God's power within the confines of your church.
Yeah.
So here, God's power is on display here.
Yeah.
And it's also completely misconceiving of God's power. Like, God's power
That's a
isn't...
great point, because in the Assemblies of God, you know, and I went to one of their seminaries. Effectively, they teach that the infilling of the Holy Spirit, the first sign is speaking with tongues. Like they propositionally, categorically say, yeah, if you didn't speak in tongues, you don't got it.
Right.
You know.
Right.
Which is kind of yeah, it's definitely kind of fighting words. I mean, you're basically saying most Christians aren't filled with the Spirit, is basically what you're saying.
Right. And it's also looking to the Spirit to be something that, like, that is giving some kind of like some power demonstration of how it is of benefit to you.
Yeah.
Which ties it to the prosperity gospel, which ties it to all the healing ministries. And I believe that healing miracles are very real and that healing miracles genuinely happen. But there are a lot of these healing ministries that are definitely genning up, like, fake healing miracles for very cynical reasons that have to do with anything that have nothing to do with God. So there is like a connection. There is a power connection. Now that is very different from someone who is, like, speaking in tongues in their private prayer, because it's like they no longer have words to express, and they're in this private communication with God, trying to relate to God. That is totally different. That is totally different. So
well, yeah, and that's
I might have talked myself into thinking that Bock had a point, but I think there were some other things that he. So it's not that, and it's, I guess he just chose to emphasize that one because it was the least obvious, I suppose. The other ones are more obvious from the text. So he's trying to bring out the one that's more symbolic and a little bit harder to get out of a cursory reading.
Well, I mean, he's making a direct connection. He's making a direct connection to Balaam, who was a man of the spoken word, right? Like, he was speaking blessings and speaking cursings, and this seems to be the charge, right?
And he had power.
What you're doing with your words, and I think that's why he connects it to tongues, because the words are being kind of used as a form of sorcery, right? To possess and to wield.
That's exactly, to possess and to wield, and this often happens. And it's like, first of all, I know lots of wonderful Pentecostals, including my mother. But there is, like, and my mother would certainly, this is a critique that I know that my mother would share, is that sometimes what you see in Pentecostal churches is, like, definitely a tendency to wield God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Play the certain song, do the certain ritual, you know, and there's almost a demand that God show up in some demonstrable form.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and then when that happens, who actually did that? You or God? Like, that's where the line gets blurred, you know, I think, for people.
Right.
Like,
right.
You can't help but associate the fact that you did this, that, and, you know, you did A, B, and C, and then God showed up. Oh, well, then you know, this was the problem I had when I went to the Toronto Blessing Church. I felt like there was a lot of conjuring going on. I was like, what are you guys doing? Like, so if you do this and that and the other thing and God shows up, who did that? You know, like what comes to my mind here too is the story of Saul when he consulted the witch for Samuel, right? It wasn't that Samuel couldn't be consulted, but it was that he was wielding the power to do so, right? And God didn't want him to do that. And it wasn't that Samuel didn't show up. Samuel did show up, right? But it was the fact that Saul took it into his own hands. He decided and he consulted and he went above and beyond kind of what God wanted him to do.
Right.
It's that wielding and possessing thing.
Right. It really becomes more like magic at that point.
It
Yeah.
does.
It's really, and that's really what it is. You're doing magic. It's not really. I mean, because the minute you're trying to control, I think that's exactly
Yes.
what you're crossing that line. Like that's the line to me. That's the line
Yeah.
between magic and enchantment. Is like enchantment is
Yes.
really just like sees the wonder and the beauty that's there
Mhm.
and appreciates it. You know, and
You know, there's a really
and
good
honors it.
expression of that.
What's that?
There's a good expression of that in Lilith when Mr. Vane first sees the raven, right? He's sitting in the library and he's reading a book, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees the gardener or the butler or some guy come in with tails. And he's a long, lanky guy with a big nose. You know, he's a raven, right?
Right.
And then he sees him, and then he doesn't pay him any mind. And then all of a sudden he sees him. He sees another movement, and he looks, and it's a raven, but it's the same guy, right? And then the raven starts moving up the stairs, and takes him up to this room, and then the raven hops into a mirror, right? And Mr. Vane is just like blindly, like intrigued and following, and he leans. He sees the raven in the mirror, in the distance, in some other world. And he leans forward to get a closer look, and he falls through the mirror, right?
Mm.
He's not wielding anything.
Right.
He's just completely engrossed in his own curiosity, right? And
That's right.
and then as he gets to the point where he can go in and out, his ability to go through the mirror gets smaller.
Right.
Actually,
And
which is really
enchanted
kind of
and
interesting.
enchanted worlds are always like they're always entered through like doorways and portals and mirrors. They're not like they're not something, and usually they're something that you fall into by accidents. Like you just like it just happens to enchantment happens to you. You don't make it happen.
Yes.
So
Right.
Whereas
And
magic
that
is something
seems
that
to be the way God.
Right. Yes, exactly. And the way to experience enchantment is to let it happen to you. Because it's there all around you all the time.
Yeah.
Which is why I talked there earlier about
which is what I was talking about this morning.
Which the more we try to, the more we're like the monkey. And we're just trying to grasp and grab and hold what we can see that's easy for us to access. You know, if we stop metaphorically, there's a nice bright ripe mango like right above our heads that we would see if we let go of the shiny object in the trap and looked up and paid attention. It's right there. It's just not as easy for us to see because we're fixated on this narrow vision. So, and you know what? The monkey would enjoy the mango a lot more ultimately than the shiny object. Because it nourishes and it's delicious and it's beautiful. So.
Yeah. And it's real and it's every day too, right? It's banal.
Right, exactly.
Like, he probably passed all the mangoes on his way to the trap.
probably in a mango forest and didn't notice it. There's nothing but mango trees all around. It's a monkey paradise. Just had to not be focused on the narrow vision. So yeah.
Well, that was what I was saying earlier about enchantment and making everything sacramental that you do. Like if you realize that when you open your oven door and you pull out that roast that you made for your family, that you're affecting the whole world.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
You made that roast for the whole world.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Not just for you and your kids and your husband. The whole world is going to benefit from this roast. And then you want that roast to be the best roast. And, you know, you're going to work hard at that roast being enough for everybody and having the best flavor, and everything becomes sacramental, right? Because you're participating in the body, literally, of
Yes.
Christ.
Right.
Everything, right?
Yes.
And when you, like the monkey, run for that trap and stick your hand in it, you missed all the mangoes, right? Like suddenly the roast isn't, you know, now you're pissed because you got to stay home and make a roast for your family, and you really wanted to go to the movies with your girlfriend.
Yes.
But, you know, yeah.
That's really good. That's really good. So, any of the other like interpretations of the messages to the churches that stood out, other than that one? I thought the interesting part about.
I was curious about that Sibylline.
Oh right, yeah, that one, like where he connects the Jezebel.
My internet's lagging.
I'm hearing you just fine.
Okay.
So the yeah, he connects the Jezebel reference to the Sibyls. Where's that at? Let's see if I can find that really quick. Michael, you still with us?
Yeah, I've got it here.
Okay.
It says, again, it is difficult to imagine how in a church where John had been at work, the influence of Jezebel should have taken such root. But here too, something concrete is referred to. The spiritual life of those days was still extensively influenced by sibyls. These were women of a type easily excited to ecstasy and who became mediums and were able to speak as oracles. Important Sibylline localities were scattered over the whole world. Thus Nero could seek counsel from the Cumaean Sibyl. There were also, however, Christian Sibyls, and the Sibylline books, collections of Sibylline maxims on a Christian basis, formed a large part of the apocryphal literature of early Christendom. I looked it up actually on a Catholic website, Nate, and it was quite widely referenced, these Sibylline books. Did you know that?
Yeah. Like that's the Pajot's recent episode where he had Richard Rowland on from Ammon Sewell. He was talking about he'd been going through the Sibylline oracles and talked about how many of them were of a later date and of Christian Sibyls. So that to me made sense, because I mean he's referencing an Old Testament, like, you know, prophetess. So I think it has to be something related to, and it's somehow different from whatever was going on in Pergamon. So it's that seemed to be I didn't seem to have any problem with that. That seemed to be a likely link in terms of historical
but
context.
then he says further down again, John rejects the Sibyls. Huh?
He says what?
Further down, he says John rejects the Sibyls more sharply than Paul by calling the Sibyls children of Jezebel.
Right.
He desires that in the churches which are to embody the spirituality of the present, Christ and not the Sibyls is to be sought as the only one whose eyes flash flames of fire. Christ is to be seen as the Lord of a new type of spirituality, Normal consciousness is not to be suppressed. On the contrary, it is to be enhanced. Everywhere, the spirit of the apocalypse urges a conversion of the remnants from bygone phases of humanity into a balanced, dignified, Christ-filled ego consciousness appropriate to the present and the future, which reminds me of Barfield.
Right. And well,
Right
also like one of the reasons like that kind of a like that obsession with like prophetic future and the, like that future mindedness, I think is a huge trap, because it frankly it focuses your vision to the wrong place. You're not considering the lilies of the fields. If you're trying, if you're too busy reading the Apocalypse of St. John or the Book of Revelation to try to figure out like when the Antichrist is coming and who the Antichrist might be and like what future events are unfolding, or if you're worried about like what's going to happen in the next election cycle, or like what and like what prophecies might point toward the outcome of what's going to happen in that election cycle, then that's probably not a good thing. It's probably not a healthy concern.
Yeah.
So yeah, because prophecy is for all times. Wondering what a prophecy might have to say about your moment in history is
Well,
a
it was
different
just
matter
interesting.
altogether.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
I just thought it was interesting that, that he says here that Jesus is leading us into a new type of spirituality where the apocalypse urges a conversion of the bygone, of the remnants from bygone phases of humanity. And he's talking about a consciousness here into a balanced, dignified, Christ-filled ego consciousness, right? Which is kind of what Barfield talks about when he refers to final participation.
Yeah, that's right. He's talking about making
balanced, dignified, Christ-filled ego consciousness.
Making an appropriate break from original participation. So yes, that's another way of looking at this, like especially like through that Barfieldian lens, like you were mentioning, where the reason this is critiqued is that it's like it's rooted in original participation too much, and it's not, and it's denying that conscious awareness that is characteristic of conscious that is like the conscious participation of final participation. So it's pointing you in the wrong direction because of that. So which
do you think that that's kind of what the argument he's making about tongues is as well?
Yes, I think that is the argument that he's making, is that it's tied to that same sort of like original participation kind of consciousness in a way that's, there's a danger. And basically he's actually kind of saying, don't look back and don't look forward.
Right.
Focus your consciousness on what's before you.
Yeah.
And that seems right to me, because we can't bring back like whatever it was in our golden past that we think that we have lost. That's where it's going to stay. We can't bring it back. We can study the past and learn from it, but we can't ever bring it back. And if we are too focused on the future, then we're going to miss the present, and the present is where we're supposed to be living. We're supposed to be trying.
I wonder if that's also a reference.
That's a reference to the Sabbath for sure. To tie it back to the conversation about the Sabbath earlier.
Right, but I'm also wondering if that's kind of what Jesus is referring to when he says, "Let the dead bury the dead."
Yes, that is.
Yeah.
Jesus says all. This is something that there are a lot of sayings of Jesus where he's definitely like telling his disciples. He's telling them not to worry about like, don't worry about what's coming down the road tomorrow. Don't be focused on like lots and lots of his sayings are pointing in that direction of being focused on the now, which is kind of like that's that Sabbath mode of living. That's how you live into the peace of God. That's how you enter the kingdom.
Right.
Is by being focused on the presence, where eternity can touch. What was that, Michael? Hello? I think we might have lost Michael. Oh, there he is.
Hey, sorry guys, I probably have to get off here.
Oh, it's okay. No problem.
My wife she's needs some help with something.
No problem. I think we covered like most of the important bases. Is there any last thoughts that you wanted to share before you sign off?
No, this chapter has been difficult for whatever reason. I don't know why. I think because it gets hung up for me in certain things that cause my mind to go, is that true or not? Like, whereas some of the other stuff I had that same reaction to, and then on further cycling through it, I kind of could see it. So this one was like, I felt like I just found myself stumbling more, but I feel like I need to reread it again a few more times. I mean, I've probably read it at least half a dozen times, but I
had the same experience, Michael. So I can kind of like, from my end, I can validate that. I was like, well, like the early part of the chapter, it's like, okay, it's like in terms of like the number symbolism, I had no problem with any of that. But then some of his interpretations of like the letters to the churches, I was like, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it's a little too matchy precise for me.
Right.
Whereas a lot of the other stuff, it's like at a different layer where there's a little bit more nuance and there's more room for interpretation versus this is very precise.
Yeah, it's almost too analytical for its own good.
Yeah, it feels very modern.
Yeah, right. Well, he is a modern after all, as are we all, So, but there are still like, I think there are some brilliant bits in it too, though, despite those differences. But yeah, I kind of had that same issue. So, I think Sherry, did you have any like parting thoughts? Sherry?
No, this was one of those chapters that I found particularly easy to understand.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is kind of, but I think for me, what I kept in mind was how he talked about, when he mentions the cycles of time, like the 7 days and the seven being an evolution or a series of events, then you can, Michael, if you look at it that way, those 7 letters are kind of indicative of a development of sorts in the evolution of the individual. It gets really quite Harding-esque a little bit later in the
individual and also collective.
I think.
Well, I'd definitely be interested to see you guys elaborate on that, and maybe without my bunny trails, we would have gotten deeper into that. But
I think he is pointing toward like both like a kind of individual evolution. He's also saying that these like represent like evolutionary phases of the church over time too. So it's that's why it's, because it's 7 that ties it to time for him, because it's representing that evolutionary cycle of time. So it represents both evolution on the individual level, like you were saying, Sherry, but it also represents like evolution within the church over time as well.
One of the things, like what reminded me of Harding was the way that he phrased that. It was like, it's fractal in nature, right? Like it's what we were talking about with James the last time, when he said he was experiencing the whole history of the world in his own conversion. Right.
Yes.
It's that same idea where you have this evolution of, this development thing happening across this circuit of churches that John is visiting, but that same thing is going on in the individual as well. So
because that's very
much what Harding.
Right. As like as a child, we're definitely we're definitely closer
Sorry.
to that. No, that's fine. As a child, we're definitely closer to that participatory consciousness of ancient times. Just as he points that like that Ephesus being connected to like this, like, you know, being more closely connected to the pagan ancient world is like represents like a phase in like church development where it's still, you know, closer to that too. So it's a move that's happening
Right.
collectively, because the churches ultimately are, I mean, the letters are written to the angels of the churches, right, which are kind of like the spirit world representation of these collective gatherings of human beings, and ultimately all of those together end up creating the body of Christ, which is the, you know, the full set of those that of that smaller set of collectives. So yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. So I think that pretty much wraps up this chapter, and next time we'll be doing chapter 3, which I know we're all excited for. So that's kind of like we've been waiting for that one. So that should be fun. All right. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll send you guys a link as soon as I get it up.
Awesome.
All
Thanks.
right.
Thanks for setting this up, Nate.
Yep, you got it.
Yeah.